It began not with a grand announcement, but with a sealed door deep inside Buckingham Palace, one that only a handful of senior royals were permitted to enter. When Prince Edward emerged hours later, his expression was unreadable, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. Something had been uncovered, something private, and at its center was Prince Philip. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. There had been no official notice, no briefing to the press, no carefully worded palace statement to soften the edges of what was unfolding behind those guarded walls. Instead, there was only movement, quiet, deliberate, almost surgical. Reports suggest that the meeting had been convened with unusual urgency, drawing in not just Prince Edward, but a small circle of senior custodians tied to royal archives and estate records. These were not the faces typically associated with ceremonial duties or public engagements. These were the keepers of memory, the guardians of documents that were never meant to be seen under ordinary circumstances. And their presence alone hinted that this was no routine review of history. It was something far more consequential. Those familiar with the inner workings of Buckingham Palace began to notice the shift almost immediately. Aides who normally moved with quiet confidence now carried a different kind of weight in their steps, as though each corridor held an unspoken question. Conversations were cut short. Doors that usually remained ajar were firmly closed. Insiders whisper that instructions had been issued with striking clarity, absolute confidentiality, no leaks, no speculation. It was a level of secrecy that even seasoned royal staff found unsettling, suggesting that whatever had been uncovered carried implications that reached beyond simple preservation or cataloging. And then there was Edward himself, the quiet sentinel of the monarchy, a man who decades of service had rarely placed him at the center of unfolding drama. Yet here he was, walking out of that restricted chamber not with ceremony, but with a collection of secured documents held tightly in hand. Observers noted the detail immediately. These were not ordinary files. They were sealed, marked, and handled with the kind of care reserved for materials of exceptional sensitivity. His posture remained composed, but there was something in his expression, something restrained, almost reflective, that hinted at the gravity of what he had just encountered. The whispers began cautiously at first, circulating among palace administrative streams and eventually reaching the ears of those who had long tracked the subtle rhythms of royal life. A phrase started to emerge, repeated in hushed tones and careful conversations: a personal vault. It was a concept that felt both improbable and entirely fitting for a figure like Prince Philip, a man known for his precision, his independence, and his deep commitment to legacy. If such a vault existed, it would not be a mere collection of artifacts. It would be a curated narrative, a private archive of meaning, intention, and perhaps even instruction. What made the situation even more compelling was the timing. Coming at a moment when the monarchy itself was navigating uncertainty and transition, the sudden resurfacing of something so intimately tied to Prince Philip carried a weight that could not be ignored. Why now? Why this discovery at this precise moment, when the institution was already balancing tradition with the pressures of a changing world? Different interpretations of the meeting describe a quiet but unmistakable realization settling over those present that this was not just about the past. It was about the future and who would be entrusted to carry it forward. But what Edward discovered inside that sealed archive wasn't just historical, it was deeply personal and potentially explosive. For decades, Prince Philip was known as the monarchy's silent architect, a man who preferred action over attention. But behind the public image lay a private world few ever saw. Now, reports suggest that hidden within royal grounds was a carefully curated vault, one that held not just artifacts, but fragments of a legacy never meant for public eyes. To understand the weight of that discovery, one has to step beyond the public ceremonies and polished appearances that defined Prince Philip's life, and into the quieter, more deliberate choices that shaped his personal legacy. He was never a man driven by spectacle. Insiders often describe him as methodical, even relentless in his pursuit of purpose. Someone who viewed the monarchy not as a stage, but as a structure that required constant reinforcement. His interests reflected that mindset: engineering, naval tradition, innovation, and above all, continuity. These were not hobbies. They were extensions of how he understood duty itself. And over time, those interests began to take form in ways the public never fully grasped. Among the most powerful symbols of that private world was the Royal Yacht Britannia, a vessel that, according to royal historians, was far more than a means of travel. It was, in many ways, a floating extension of the crown's authority, a place where diplomacy unfolded behind closed doors and where some of the monarchy's most delicate conversations took place. For Philip, Britannia was personal. It represented not just service, but identity, a connection to his naval roots, and a reminder of a life defined by discipline and precision. When it was decommissioned, reports suggest he felt the loss deeply, not in public statements, but in the quiet ways he chose to preserve its memory. That preservation, it now seems, may have gone far beyond what anyone realized. Various interpretations from palace insiders point to a collection carefully assembled over decades of items tied directly to Britannia and to Philip's broader life of service. Not just photographs or ceremonial gifts, but documents, personal notes, and objects that carried meaning only he could fully articulate. Each piece, it is whispered, was chosen with intent, forming a narrative that was never meant for exhibition, but for understanding. A legacy not displayed, but safeguarded. And this is where the idea of the vault begins to take on a different significance. Because if such a collection existed, it would not have been created casually. It would have been deliberate, structured, and, above all, private. Sources close to royal archival staff suggest that certain materials linked to Philip were always treated differently, catalogued separately, accessed rarely, and discussed even less. It was as though they existed in a category of their own, outside the usual systems that govern royal preservation. A hidden layer beneath the already guarded history of the monarchy. The emotional weight of such a collection is difficult to overstate. These were not just remnants of a public life. They were fragments of a man's inner world, preserved in silence. And perhaps that is why they remained undisclosed for so long. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of respect for the privacy of a figure who spent his entire life in service, yet kept parts of himself carefully shielded from view. To reveal such a collection prematurely would have risked turning something deeply personal into something merely observed. But now, with the vault no longer a rumor but an unfolding reality, the focus shifts from what was hidden to who was chosen to uncover it. Because in a family defined by hierarchy and expectation, decisions like this are never accidental. They are intentional, measured, and often deeply symbolic. And yet, the question remained, why was Prince Edward the one chosen to uncover it? What lay behind that vault door wasn't just a collection, it was a revelation. Insiders whisper that Prince Edward stood in silence as the contents were revealed, each item telling a story of loyalty, duty, and personal sacrifice. But among them was something far more significant, a designation that would alter the course of royal inheritance. By the time Edward crossed the threshold into that restricted chamber, the weight of expectation had already settled in. This was no ceremonial walkthrough, no symbolic gesture for the sake of protocol. Reports suggest that access had been granted under highly controlled conditions, with only a select few present individuals whose roles were tied not to public representation, but to the preservation of the monarchy's most guarded records. Even among them, there was an understanding that what they were about to witness had been deliberately shielded for decades. The first layer of the discovery, according to various interpretations, appeared almost deceptively straightforward. Carefully preserved artifacts, each catalogued with precision, each carrying a quiet but unmistakable significance. Items linked to the Royal Yacht Britannia surfaced again and again: navigation instruments, personal correspondence, and ceremonial objects that had once existed within the rhythm of royal duty, but had since vanished from public awareness. These were not random keepsakes. They formed a pattern, a narrative of movement, diplomacy, and private reflection. A life lived not just in service, but in constant motion, always anchored to a deeper sense of responsibility. But it was not the artifacts alone that held Edward's attention. Those familiar with the moment describe a shift, a subtle but undeniable change in atmosphere as the deeper layers of the vault were revealed. Because beneath the visible collection lay something far more deliberate. Documents. Sealed, structured, and unmistakably intentional. They were not arranged as mere records of the past. They were positioned as if they were meant to be found, but only at the right time, and only by the right person. Insiders claim that Edward's reaction was not one of surprise, but of recognition. as though the pieces, once seen together, formed a picture he had long sensed but never fully understood. Each document carried weight not just legal or historical, but emotional. References to stewardship, mentions of continuity, subtle language that suggested not ownership, but guardianship. And woven through it all was a tone that felt unmistakably personal, as if Prince Philip had been speaking not to the institution, but to an individual. That is where the tension began to build. Because the deeper Edward moved into the collection, the clearer it became that this was not a shared legacy in the traditional sense. It was selective, focused, almost exclusive. Various sources close to royal archival processes suggest that certain instructions appeared to be directed, not broadly, but specifically. Not as a general guideline for the family, but as a precise designation. A choice made quietly, without announcement, and preserved in a way that ensured it would only surface under exact circumstances. The emotional weight of that realization is difficult to overstate. This was not simply about inheritance in the conventional sense. It was about trust, about intention, about a lifetime of decisions culminating in a final act of clarity. Edward, long regarded as the quiet figure within the royal structure, now found himself at the center of something far more profound, not because he had sought it, but because it had been placed in his path, deliberately and without ambiguity. And yet, even as the significance of the discovery settled in, questions began to surface. Why had this been kept hidden for so long? Why had no indication been given during Philip's lifetime? And perhaps most pressing of all, what would this mean for the balance of legacy within the royal family itself? Because hidden among those relics was a decision Prince Philip had made long before his passing. It wasn't written in bold ink or announced with ceremony, but its meaning was unmistakable. According to emerging reports, Prince Philip had named a sole steward of his private collection. And that name wasn't the one many had expected. It was Prince Edward the Quiet Royal, who had spent decades in the background. The realization did not arrive with fanfare. It unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as the pieces of the discovery aligned into something undeniable. Insiders suggest that the documents found within the vault did not declare Edward's role in grand, sweeping language. Instead, they spoke in measured tones, phrases carefully chosen, instructions subtly framed. Yet the intent was clear. This was not a shared guardianship. It was singular, deliberate. And for those who understood the inner mechanics of royal legacy, it carried a weight that could not be dismissed. What made the revelation even more striking was how unexpected it seemed to those outside the immediate circle. In a monarchy often defined by hierarchy and visibility, Edward had long occupied a quieter space. He was not the headline figure, not the one whose name dominated public discourse. And yet, those who had observed his journey closely were perhaps less surprised, because beneath that understated presence was a record of unwavering consistency, decades of service carried out without spectacle, without controversy, and without the need for recognition. Reports from royal commentators, and those familiar with internal dynamics, suggest that Philip had always valued that kind of steadiness. It was not the loudest voice or the most visible role that earned trust within his world. It was reliability, precision, a willingness to uphold duty without deviation. And in Edward, many believe he saw those qualities reflected with quiet clarity. Their connection, often described as understated but deeply rooted, was built not on public gestures, but on shared understanding and alignment of values that did not need to be spoken to be recognized. That connection now takes on a different significance, because this decision, preserved in secrecy and revealed only under specific conditions, suggests a level of intention that goes far beyond convenience or circumstance. It points to something more personal, a belief that the legacy contained within that vault required not just protection, but interpretation, someone who would understand not only what it was, but what it meant, and perhaps more importantly, what it was never meant to become. Within royal circles, the reaction has been described as measured, even restrained. There have been no public challenges, no visible fractures, but that does not mean the decision has gone unnoticed. Various interpretations suggest a quiet recalibration taking place behind the scenes, as those connected to the broader legacy begin to process what this singular designation implies. Because in a family where history is shared and symbolism is everything, The act of naming one individual carries echoes that extend far beyond the immediate moment. At its core, this inheritance is not about possession. It is about trust, about the transfer of responsibility from one generation to another, guided not by expectation, but by intention. The memorabilia, the documents, the carefully preserved fragments of a life lived in service, they are not simply objects. They are markers of continuity. And by placing them in Edward's care, Philip appears to have made a statement, not just about the past, but about the future he envisioned. But with such a decision comes inevitable questions about fairness, about legacy, and about those left out. No public statements were made, no objections voiced. But behind palace walls, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. Because when legacy is divided even quietly, it rarely goes unnoticed. And those closest to the royal inner circle began to sense that this decision carried implications far beyond a private collection. At first, the reaction was almost imperceptible. Pause in conversation here. A measured glance, their subtle signals that something within the established rhythm of royal life had been quietly disrupted. Insiders suggest that while the decision naming Prince Edward as sole steward was never publicly contested, it was certainly absorbed with a level of attention that bordered on unease. Because within the monarchy, inheritance is never just about objects or documents. It is about meaning, about hierarchy, about the unspoken understanding of who holds what and why. Various interpretations from those familiar with royal tradition indicate that such decisions are typically shared, distributed, or at the very least, symbolically inclusive. The idea of a singular designation, especially one tied to something so personal and historically significant, introduced a different dynamic. It raised questions that were never voiced aloud, but were nevertheless present. Had others expected involvement? Perhaps not in an official capacity, but in some form of acknowledgement. And yet, that expectation, if it existed, remained unfulfilled. What made the situation even more delicate was the palace's response, or rather, its absence. There were no clarifications, no carefully constructed narratives to guide public understanding. Instead, there was silence. A controlled, deliberate silence that suggested a decision had been made not just to protect the details, but to contain the reaction itself. Sources close to palace communications describe a strategy rooted in restraint, allowing the matter to exist without amplification, trusting that its significance would remain confined within the walls where it originated. But silence, as it often does, began to speak in other ways. Media observers and royal commentators started to pick up on the subtle shifts, not through official channels, but through patterns, changes in tone, the absence of expected appearances, the quiet emphasis placed on Edward's role in certain contexts. It was not overt, it was not declared, but it was noticed. And once noticed, it began to form a narrative of its own. The broader implications of this decision extend beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved. Because in a monarchy built on continuity, every act of inheritance carries a message about how that continuity is maintained. By choosing a single steward, Prince Philip appears to have redefined, in a quiet but unmistakable way, how personal legacy can be preserved within a public institution. It suggests a shift, subtle but significant, toward a more intentional, perhaps even more guarded approach to what is passed down and to whom. And yet, beneath the speculation and the quiet recalibration, there is another layer to consider. One that moves beyond questions of inclusion or exclusion and into something far more fundamental. Because this decision, for all its complexity, may not have been about division at all. It may have been about ensuring that something deeply personal remained intact, protected from dilution, and preserved exactly as it was intended. And yet, the true weight of Philip's decision wasn't about division, it was about preservation. In the end, this wasn't about ownership, it was about guardianship. Prince Philip's legacy, carefully assembled over decades, now rested in the hands of someone he trusted implicitly, not for status, not for recognition, but for continuity. As the implications of that decision began to settle, a quiet clarity emerged around what this inheritance truly represented. It was not a transfer of wealth in the traditional sense, nor a symbolic gesture designed to elevate one figure above others. Instead, it was something far more deliberate, a passing of responsibility, defined not by possession, but by preservation. Those familiar with royal traditions often describe this distinction as critical. Within the monarchy, the most meaningful legacies are not owned. They are held, protected, and carried forward with care. And in this case, that responsibility had been placed squarely in Prince Edward's hands. There is a certain weight that comes with being a custodian rather than an owner. Ownership implies control, the freedom to alter or reshape. Custodianship, however, demands restraint. It requires discipline, respect, and an understanding that what has been entrusted must remain intact. Reports suggest that Edward understood this distinction immediately. His response, described by insiders as measured and deeply reflective, carried none of the triumph that might accompany such a revelation. Instead, there was a sense of quiet acceptance, as though he recognized that this was not a moment of elevation, but of obligation. The items within the collection only deepened that sense of responsibility. The Royal Yacht Britannia, once a moving symbol of diplomacy and continuity, now exists within this legacy as something almost sacred. The memorabilia tied to it, each piece carefully preserved, represents more than history. It represents a philosophy, a way of serving that prioritized duty above all else. For Philip, Britannia was never just a vessel. It was an extension of the crown's presence, a place where decisions were made, relationships were forged, and the quiet work of monarchy unfolded beyond public view. To preserve its memory is to preserve that ethos. And that, perhaps, is the heart of Philip's decision. It was not about selecting a favorite or redefining hierarchy. It was about ensuring that the values he held most closely would endure, unaltered by time or circumstance. Those values, discipline, loyalty, precision, and an unwavering commitment to duty, are not easily preserved in a world that constantly evolves. They require a steward who understands their significance not as abstract ideals, but as lived principles. In Edward, Philip appears to have found that understanding. The symbolism of this inheritance extends beyond the objects themselves. It speaks to a broader idea of legacy. Within the monarchy, one that is not defined by visibility or acclaim, but by continuity, by the ability to carry forward something intangible, something that cannot be easily displayed or explained. Edward's acceptance of this role, quiet and unembellished, reinforces that idea. There was no announcement, no declaration, only the steady continuation of a duty that had now taken on a deeper dimension. But even as this legacy is preserved in silence, it exists within an institution that cannot remain entirely hidden from public view. The monarchy, by its very nature, is both private and public, its stories unfolding across both realms in ways that are often unpredictable. And when something as significant as this begins to surface, even in fragments, it carries with it the potential to reshape understanding, to invite scrutiny, and to draw attention to what was once carefully concealed. But even the most carefully preserved legacy can't remain hidden forever. What began as whispers within palace corridors soon found its way into the public sphere. Reports surfaced, analysts speculated, and suddenly, a private decision became a topic of national fascination. Because when it comes to the royal family, even silence tells a story. At first, the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to those outside the tightly controlled world of royal affairs. A passing mention in a column, a carefully worded observation from a seasoned royal correspondent. But then, as if guided by an unseen current, the fragments began to align. Media outlets, drawing from palace-adjacent sources and long-established networks of information, started to piece together what had once been confined to quiet conversations. The idea of a hidden vault, of a private collection tied to Prince Philip, moved from speculation into something far more tangible, something that demanded attention. Public curiosity followed swiftly. For decades, Prince Philip had been perceived through a particular lens: steadfast, disciplined, often reserved. His public image was well established, shaped by years of duty and defined by consistency. And yet, the emergence of this private archive introduced a new dimension, one that invited people to reconsider what they thought they knew. What else had remained unseen? What other aspects of his life had been carefully held back, preserved not for display, but for understanding? Royal experts and historians were quick to weigh in, though their interpretations varied. Some described the discovery as a natural extension of Philip's character, pointing to his meticulous nature and his deep respect for history. Others suggested that the existence of such a collection hinted at something more. Intentional, a deliberate effort to shape how his legacy would be interpreted long after his passing. Insiders whisper that even among those accustomed to the monarchy's layers of secrecy, this revelation stood apart. It was not just about what had been hidden, but about why it had been hidden in the first place. The contrast between public image and private reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. On one hand, there was the Prince Philip known to the world as a figure of stability, often defined by his role within the institution. On the other, there was this newly emerging narrative of a man who had quietly curated his own legacy, selecting what would endure and how it would be understood. It introduced a tension, a sense that beneath the familiar surface lay a far more complex story. At the center of that story was the Royal Yacht Britannia, once again capturing attention in ways it had not for years. Discussions resurfaced about its significance, its role in shaping diplomatic relationships, and its place within the broader history of the monarchy. But now, those discussions carried a different tone. They were no longer just reflections on the past. They were tied to the present, to the idea that Britannia and the memories associated with it had been deliberately preserved within a private framework, entrusted to a single individual. And that individual, Prince Edward, found himself increasingly drawn into the narrative. Not through public statements or overt actions, but through association. The more the story unfolded, the clearer his role became, not as a figure seeking attention, but as one placed at the center of a legacy that was only now beginning to reveal itself. The quiet royal, long defined by his absence from controversy, was now linked to one of the most intriguing developments in recent royal history. And as the story unfolded, one truth became impossible to ignore. In a monarchy defined by tradition, every decision carries weight, but some echo far beyond their moment. Prince Philip's final gesture wasn't loud or ceremonial. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. A final act of trust that revealed not just what he valued, but who he believed would protect it. By the time the full meaning of that decision settled into public consciousness, the story had already transformed from a quiet internal matter into something far more enduring. What had begun as a sealed vault and a private discovery had evolved into a reflection of how legacy itself is defined within the monarchy. Not by titles, not by visibility, but by trust. And in naming Prince Edward as the sole steward of his carefully preserved world, Prince Philip had, in many ways, rewritten the expectations surrounding inheritance within an institution built on centuries of rigid structure. Because this was never about elevating one figure above another. It was about identifying the one individual who could carry forward something intangible. The memorabilia, the documents, the fragments of a life lived with discipline and purpose, these were not prizes to be claimed. They were responsibilities to be upheld. And in that distinction lies the deeper message behind Philip's choice. Legacy, as he defined it, was not a reward for position. It was a test of character, a quiet measure of who understood the weight of continuity and who could bear it without seeking recognition. Prince Edward now stands at the center of that responsibility, though not in the way many might expect. There are no grand declarations marking this transition, no ceremonial acknowledgement that would draw attention to his role. Instead, his position unfolds in silence, much like the legacy he has been entrusted to protect. Insiders suggest that this is precisely what was intended, that the preservation of such a collection requires not only care, but discretion. It demands a steady hand, one that will not reshape or reinterpret, but will safeguard and sustain. The symbolism of the collection itself continues to resonate. The echoes of the Royal Yacht Britannia, the carefully chosen artifacts, the structured documents, they form a narrative that extends beyond a single lifetime. They represent a philosophy of service, one rooted in discipline, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to duty. And now, through Edward, that philosophy is carried forward, not as a public display, but as a living responsibility. A thread connecting past to future, held firmly but quietly within the fabric of the monarchy. As the story reaches its natural conclusion, what remains is not a sense of division or controversy, but a deeper understanding of what legacy truly means within this world. It is not about who receives, it is about who preserves, not about ownership, but about guardianship, and perhaps most importantly, not about recognition, but about continuity. Prince Philip's final decision, revealed not through ceremony but through discovery, serves as a reminder that the most powerful acts are often the ones carried out in silence. Because in the end, the true inheritance wasn't the collection itself, it was the responsibility to carry a legacy forward, in silence and in service. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.